Greetings. This lecture is for Management 570, our lecture on motivation. This may be a review for some of you, particularly if you've studied any psychology. These are basic motivation theories that you would have learned in any introduction to psychology course. Not everybody has had that experience, so I think it's really important that we understand motivation theories and how this influences our ability to lead employees on a day-to-day basis, to manage them based on HR policies, practices. So as we understand the basics of motivation theory, we can see how it's applied then in the business context, managing our employees on a day-to-day basis when it comes to things like compensation and performance appraisal and recruitment and selection and things like that. So this will be very short, but pretty straightforward lecture on that material. So motivation is defined as the set of processes that arouse, direct, and maintain human behavior towards attaining some goal, whatever that goal may be. So when we discuss how someone gets motivated, it comes from the way that our brains perceive things. For example, there is an arousal. Something gets our attention. It's part of that perceptual process. Something gets our attention, we focus on it. Then it has guidelines, right? It says, this is what I want you to do, and this is the direction I want you to head. So we can have people walk in that direction and do the thing that we want them to do. The bigger challenge is how do we maintain this over the long haul? Because we might be able to get someone to do something in this moment or today, but how do we get them to repeat that behavior every single day? How do we get them continually moving towards that goal with the appropriate reinforcement, with the appropriate incentive set up for them? And that's where we use reinforcement theories of motivation in order to sustain the behaviors the way that we want them to and over a certain period of time. Can you motivate workers? Well, the bottom line is, well, no. We create the context, but I don't have a magic button that I can press and suddenly everything absolutely happens exactly the way I want it to happen. It's not a situation where I can say, hey, here's all these things and now I know you're magically motivated, because motivation really comes from within the individual. They make that decision every day in every circumstance whether or not they're motivated to behave in the way that we want them to behave. If we have good trust, if we have created a good context, if we have a good reward system that hears them and hears the rewards that they value, then yes, they will continue to do that behavior. And if we use the right reinforcement theory, that behavior will continue on for as long as the reward is there. But there are circumstances where the individual may not be interested so much in the reward, and that could be because the project itself doesn't interest them, or it could be that the reward doesn't interest them. It could be any number of factors. I mean, someone can look at it, and even if you've done the best job ever at trying to come up with a good reward system, if the person doesn't perceive it to be an appropriate reward or perceive that they can even do it, then the bottom line is you can do all you want. The employee is not going to be motivated. And that becomes, one of those big issues for every manager out there, right? It's like, I'm doing all these things and no one seems to want to do the job that I'm asking them to do. It's because you're not tapping into the thing that drives that individual. We always assume that financial rewards are the things that drive people, and they do to a certain extent. They have some assets, some benefits, some assets. They also have some liabilities. If we do nothing but reward people financially, what we're going to find is they won't have any intrinsic reward or intrinsic value to what it is that we're doing. And what we notice in particular types of tasks, and we'll talk about this when we get into class, but there are particular types of rewards and behaviors that we're looking for, that if employees don't find the reward rewarding, they're not going to perform that task at all. They're not going to do what we expect them to do. And this has to do with whether or not these are tasks that are very rote, very predictable, very much, simple tasks where, the production is if you do more, you get more rewards, and that's great. But when we want people to do creative things, that's more problematic. It's more challenging for us. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. There are three basic questions that we need to address around the issues of motivation. The first one is, what motivates us? It's what's going to arouse our attentions, if we go back to that initial definition. And our content theories of motivation get at those sorts of things, the types of things that trigger people, that make them want to act, that these are the things that motivate people specifically. The second question then is, how do they motivate us? So how does the process work so we can use that to our advantage to direct people's attention in that way? And that's the process theories. The process theories tell us how that motivation actually occurs, what goes on in the little black box that we call our head, and it helps us to understand why some rewards might work and some rewards might not work. Not everybody believes that the same rewards are going to be of value to them. And then lastly, the maintaining the human behavior. How do we sustain that motivation over time? Well, that's done through reinforcement theories. What do we do how often do we give the reward? And should the reward be random, or should the reward be on regular intervals? Some rewards are on regular intervals. Some rewards are going to be random, or some punishments will be random. So it's essential that we understand what it is that is the behavior that we're interested in affecting, and then figure out what content, process, and reinforcement theory is going to work best in that. And this may sound like a really complex process, but it's really important that we, first of all, get to know that individual that we're trying to motivate and figure out what is the things that motivate them, how does it work in them, and then what's the best way to reinforce that for them. And this is an individualized process. It's actually not that hard in some ways, and it's really difficult in others, because it's a really straightforward process. What motivates them? How do we get them to do it? And then how do we reinforce it? But being able to be savvy enough as a manager, as a leader, to know what it is that that individual needs requires a lot more work. It requires some trust, it requires some communication, and these are the kinds of basic skills that we're going to be talking about as we go into this class. And then ultimately we're going to talk more then about the HR types of activities that managers need to be engaged in. So starting with the content theories, the two basics that most people refer to are Maslow and Oldham. And while people may argue Maslow's work is fairly old and it's antiquated, certainly he did this work in the 50s and 60s, and Oldham followed him, I think, in the 70s. It's got some face validity to it. The bottom line is, we know these are the categories of things that really tend to drive people in their behaviors. And we'll start with Maslow, and then we'll see how Oldham sort of overlays onto that. And you can see from the right-hand side where we have that triangle, that hierarchy of needs, if you will. At the very bottom we have what we call the physiological needs. Are my physiological needs being met? Do I have money? Do I have food on my table? Do I have clothes on my back? Those sorts of things. And that is a drive that pushes people to do all sorts of things, whether it's to go out and get a legitimate job, or whether it's to go out and steal. But you can understand why, when you don't have food, when you don't have clothing, when you don't have water, when you don't have things that you need to just survive on a daily basis, you're driven to get that no matter what it takes. Next, we look at the safety needs. And the safety needs are, do I feel safe and secure? Do I have a roof over my head? Do I feel like my environment is not going to be damaging to me in terms of, being harassed or being robbed, or, not having a roof over my head to take care of my, when the rain starts or when the snow comes, those kinds of things. The next level up is social needs, and the social needs are what drives people in order to belong to organizations, and what drives them to have relationships with friends and colleagues and those sorts of things. We have social needs. A lot of times those social needs get set aside when we really are working hard to get our physiological and our safety needs met. And that's the basic argument for Maslow, right? You can't have your social needs and your esteem needs and your self-actualization needs met if your physiological and safety needs aren't being addressed first. So there's a hierarchy here, which means if our physiological and safety needs are being met, then our social needs will get our attention, and we'll start working on our social needs. Making sure we've got good colleagues and support networks and friendships and things like that. Self-esteem is where we start to believe in ourself, and we believe that we have a good self-image and that we can accomplish the things that we want to accomplish. And this goes beyond the social needs, right? But it's more now about developing me as a human being. And again, when we make sure that we've got our physiological safety and social needs being met, then we can work on our self-esteem. And lastly, Maslow argues that the self-actualization is the very last thing that we need to address. And with self-actualization, that's where we reach our full potential, whatever that may be, where we actualize to become the full human being that we were meant to be, doing the thing that drives us, that motivates us, that excites us every single day. When someone says to you, what is it, what's your perfect job or your perfect career? And that's kind of what it's about, that self-actualization. So, as I said, Maslow said this is a hierarchy, and there's a thing called a frustration regression, if you will, that when your physiological or safety needs are not being met, even if you're working on your self-esteem right now, you'll go back, work on the physiology and safety, and then ultimately move forward again through the social esteem and self-actualization. It's a very linear process, and he argues that if there's anything that is not being met in the lower levels, you can't really work on your self-esteem. Imagine, right, if you don't have food on your table, you don't have water to drink, if you don't have clothes on your back or a roof over your head, who cares about self-esteem? Who cares about being self-actualized? I just need to get these basic needs met. Now, Oldham had a slightly different approach to this. As you can see, he overlaps clearly with Maslow's work. He said we have these existence needs, which are around physiology and safety and things like that. We have these relatedness needs, which are about building relationships with people. And we have these individual internalized growth needs, self-actualization, self-esteem. But what Oldham argues is just because one of these are being addressed, and are being frustrated, if you will, that maybe we're not getting our safety needs met or our social needs met, it doesn't mean that we still aren't trying to address these other issues kind of simultaneously. Clearly, these things will get our attention, right? If I need a job, and I need money, I am going to be working really hard to get a job so I can put food on my table and, a roof over my head. But also making sure I have good self-esteem will help me go get that job, right? So, or having a social network of people that we like and we trust will help us perhaps find that job. So we can be working on these areas simultaneously. They're not ranked in terms of what needs to be addressed first in terms of a hierarchy. Oldham basically says we can work on these things kind of simultaneously, which is important to know. The last content theory we're going to talk about, or the last two actually that we're going to talk about, are one is around goal setting and the other one is around job design and job characteristics. Locke and Latham argue that when we set appropriate goals for people, that it's the goals, right? Goals are what actually motivate people to behave. So that's what they believe is the thing that motivates people. It's not necessarily my needs, but it's the thing that pushes me to behave in a particular way. So if I set a goal, then that goal, it needs to be, of course, as we know, about SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, time-bound, reasonable, SMART, I'm trying to think of all of them. So yes, specific, measurable, attainable, reasonable, and time-bound. These are the important things around a goal, right? So we can't just say, well, here's your goal, go to town. We need to give people some guidelines. We need to give them a frame of reference. We need to know that this is what we want them accomplished, how we want it to do it, this is how they'll be measured, and this is what the expectation is if they don't do it. So it's really important that we give them that feedback around making sure it's attained, but at the same time, making sure it's attained in the way that we want them to. So that's part of setting an appropriate goal. And that's what happens a lot of times is when we set goals for people, if we're not really clear about what the expectations are, the goals become very vague. And we think, oh, we'll just set a vague goal for people without having a really clear definition for what we expect them to do. So we know that that sets people up to fail, right? Or gives them the opportunity to not follow through. So our goal setting basically is we make sure that people are clear about what the expectation is. And goal setting theory really informs what we do around pay for performance and compensation systems and performance appraisal systems. We set a goal, we measure how close we came to achieving that goal, and then ultimately we make a decision in the end whether or not we learn something good with that feedback loop and continue on from there. The next item is the Hackman and Oldham job design or job characteristics model. And what Hackman and Oldham are getting at in their model is that there are intrinsic rewards that we need to address. A lot of the stuff in Maslow's work and in even Alderfer's work, if we think about the physiology needs and the safety needs and things like that, those are very extrinsic focused, making sure that I have the physical things that I can physically touch, that I know that I'm safe. I have food, I have water, I have a house, I have a car that can take me where I need to go. But there are intrinsic elements to jobs, as we've already talked about, that need to be addressed. And if we focus only on the extrinsic, people won't focus on the intrinsic things and think about how important those intrinsic rewards are for us. So Hackman and Oldham decided that we can design jobs in such a way with certain aspects addressed that creates a situation where the worker can be more motivated to behave. And what does that look like? And that will be addressed on the next slide.